The other thing is, I hope that you're enjoying these sermons on the promise. They're a little bit different, but these are some things that the Lord has really been working in my life over many, many years. And sometimes you just need to put life on pause and reflect about what God is doing. And sometimes see his hand. Sometimes you think, well, I don't know where God was, well, in years past, and, is he here, is he there? When you sit back and you reflect and you begin to see God's hand at work. And so many, again, of the stories that I'm sharing in this series come from our lives. But these came as I sat back and reflected. I wish I was brilliant enough to say I learned all this along the way. I stumbled a lot. I hit my head against the wall a lot. I fell on my face a lot. And you'll see that from the sermons, because they're to glorify the Lord and not us. And so the first Sunday in this series, we talked about the promise, and that God uses the promise, a word that declares his intentions, that he uses the promise to draw faith out of us. He declares it, and then he says, do you believe me? And if you go through Scripture, you will see that God uses the promise over and over and over again. You can't ignore a promise. And that's frustrating. When someone says you can't do something, we're saying, you don't understand. I'm an American and we can. But you can't not respond to a promise. You either believe it or you don't. If you ignore it, you don't believe it. When someone walks up and says, I promise you, you look at their past, you look at who they are, you look at how many promises they fulfilled in the past. You can see the twinkle in their eye, whether they're kidding or not. You know the improbability of the promise, but you have to believe or disbelieve the promise. Last week we talked about the promise being given to us, that God uses promise. And I believe that he's given each and every one of us promises in our life. Not only in this book. Now see, there are promises that are common to each and every one of us. They're in this book. We hold those promises in common. We sing about those promises. We build our churches. We build our faith. We build our hope on the promises that are in this book. And we know that God must fulfill his promises. But I believe that it goes even beyond that God breaks into our individual lives and he gives us personal promises for our lives, for our families, for our businesses, for our church, for whatever you're associated with. He gives you promises if you are listening. Because he wants to pull that faith out of you. We talk about walking by faith. Well, how do we walk by faith? Well, when we're given a promise and we don't immediately see the fulfillment. So now we're in part 3. And I know, Charlie, you've been trying to figure this one out. Sorry. It's called the promise threatened. The promise threatened. I'm going to change. Give me another chance. Every day these words are spoken in homes across America. They come from those who physically abuse and emotionally abuse others. They abuse their mates, they abuse their children. Normally they have some sort of an addiction in their life. But they say, give me another chance. The promise is well intended. And in a strange way, the abuser really means what he or she says. And the one who's being abused really tends to believe them as well. They can believe that they can be reformed by just stopping. Unfortunately, neither person can predict how long it will be until something or someone comes comes against the fulfillment of the promise not to abuse. Something's going to happen. They're going to break that promise. Unless the source of their anger is addressed, the cycle of abuse will continue at some point. Many of us have made those same promises. Maybe it's not with abuse. Maybe it's in line. Maybe it's with some sort of a habit that we have. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to stop doing that. We make a vow. We make a promise. And in the case of abusers, what keeps abusers from following through on their commitments? Normally, it's an unplanned stress. Something that will threaten the temporary peace created by the vow never to hit again. Something bad happens at work and they get frustrated. Another driver's too aggressive. A local sports team loses the championship. You people that are into sports, you ever wonder sometimes why you're agitated? I've thought about that because I get agitated. It's like, well, my team lost last night. I carried it over to the next. You say, it's a sporting team. I know. The kids misbehave. Sorry about that, Quinn. I'm still happy. The kids misbehave. Dinner's burnt. It doesn't take any more than a burnt dinner for them to blow their top again. A close relative gets sick. The list of stressful things that can happen in any given day has no end. Potentially, each and one can start a chain reaction of words and actions that will eventually destroy the promise to live without hurting others. Each source of stress is a threat to the promise that they have made. I will never hit again. I will stop. Give me another chance. Left unchecked, the threat will eventually become stronger than their promise, and they will give in, and they will do it again. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you have been victims of that. Some of you have been the one that has abused. The same thing can happen to almost every promise that we make. Once words are expressed, opposition of some type arises to make sure it will never happen. Life is just that way. Haven't you ever noticed as soon as you promise something, something comes to keep you from fulfilling it? You go, well, it's just bad luck. No, it's just the way life is. Especially when you put your neck out on the line and you make a vow. Many times it's things unintentional happen. Circumstances change. You lose your job. Poor health comes. Bad decision brings unplanned results. And you can't fulfill your promise. It's especially true with sin. There are unavoidable consequences when someone steps outside the limits that God has established for the human race. Sin can keep you from fulfilling a promise because it takes you down a road away from the promise. Put it in the context of a marriage. You stand before the minister, you make certain vows that you're going to be faithful to each other, and someone breaks those vows and commits adultery. That sin breaks the promise. It's a threat to you staying in that marriage and staying together. Conflict can make it difficult to follow through on a commitment. All of these threats change the original context in which the promise was given. Fulfillment becomes more and more difficult. But I'm here to tell you, promises can be kept despite the most extreme threats. I'm laying out a case here. I know you're looking stunned. You're looking tired. You're looking, where in the world is this guy going? Hang in there. Promises can be kept despite the most extreme threats. Determination and hard work can help us get through those promises and have them fulfilled. Remember last week I talked about my parents promising to pay for my college education. It was not easy. My dad changed jobs during that time. He was not a young man. It was difficult. That was a threat to the promise. And yet he continued to work hard. They continued to invest their money. They continued to work so that they could fulfill that promise to their son. Sometimes outside resources are needed. You can't do it by yourself, and so you get family, you get friends, you get the church behind you because you have made a vow and you're trying to follow it through. Promises can be kept despite the most extreme threats. A strong commitment is indispensable, can normally overcome whatever threat comes to derail the promise before it's finished. Threats always come when God the Father extends a promise to one of his children. Notice the word always. That's scary. Always is a fighting word. You know, when you get in an argument with your spouse and you use always and never, it's going to be a big one. Always? Never? I never pick up my clothes? I always leave the trash? Always? I'm using always because I believe that each and every time God gives a promise, there is a threat that comes against that promise. Let me show you. Some of the threats have a natural source. They come about because life is constantly changing and evolving. God gives us a promise, we lose our job, we have to move to another place. That's a threat against a promise. We vow that we're going to take care of our kids' education, we're going to pay for their college, and we lose our job. That's a threat to the promise. Those are natural. They're things that happen because we're living life. However, many of the threats that fight against God's promises come from another source. There exists an active and aggressive enemy who will do anything he can to frustrate God's plans. We call that active force Satan. In John 10, Jesus says, he is both the gate to the sheepfold and the good shepherd. And he describes his enemy, the sheep's enemy, as a thief. Verse 10 explains the threefold mission of Satan. The thief comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. We know that. We have heard that many times. You see, he comes. Why does he come to steal? Why does he come to destroy? Why does he come to bring death? Because he wants to frustrate what God is doing or what God has told you he wants to do in your life. So as soon as Satan hears that there's a promise extended to you, or you begin to confess that promise to others, he comes against it because he wants to use it to destroy your faith. You see, because he knows that if God doesn't fulfill his promise, that will destroy your belief. And what does he do? He uses lies. Boy. John 8:44. We've got that scripture there. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he speaks, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So with this understanding, his threats against God's promises are normally lies. God gives you a promise, and then someone comes along and lies. The enemy begins to come against you, and he uses lies. He specializes in creating circumstances that appear to be one way when they're really not. Most of his attacks are not real. They only appear to be real. But Satan's schemes work. It doesn't matter if the threat is real or not. If someone believes it to be real, then it's real to them. You know that. It doesn't have to be real. That's the power of lie. That's the power of lying. Someone tells you something false. You believe it. It's as if it's real anyway. It's the power of illusion. You see, if the enemy's lies produces a small seed of doubt in God's promises, then he has taken the first step in stealing, killing, and destroying. Genesis chapter 3 perfectly illustrates this principle. The serpent approaches Eve with lies. Up until now, she and Adam have lived in a relationship of complete trust with their Creator, walking daily with Him in the Garden of Eden. Satan, in the form of the serpent, twisted God's instructions, twisted it, and Eve began to doubt what God had said. The Lord had commanded Adam, saying, and here's what the real thing is what He told Adam, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then the serpent comes along and he asks a question. Just a little simple question. It's not complicated. Did God really, notice the key word there, really? Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Now there's no lie there. But have you ever questioned someone? You know, they're rock solid confident in it. And you say, but did you think of this? And then all of a sudden, they start to think. And they go, really? Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe you're right. Well, it could be. I never thought of it that way. You see how the doubt begins to creep in? It's all illusion. How about the next part? The Lord also said, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. The serpent contradicted God's declaration and told the woman, you will not surely die. Everything's going to be okay. Is that what God really told you? God really told you that all of your kids are going to be saved? Did God really tell you that your business is going to succeed? Don't you know how improbable that is? You know the economy's going to crash again, don't you? You see how all that works? You're going to invest money in your business? Well, you should probably save your money. Oh, I know what God has told you. But what does God know? Satan found a way to threaten God's promise by lying. By subtle editing God's statements, he created an illusion. God's promise did not change. It was the same. It was steady. It was unaltered. The Lord was and is perfect and cannot lie. But none of this mattered at the moment of confrontation. What mattered was Eve believed the serpent's lies. Even though they had promises, even though they had relationship, she believed the lies, and that was enough to change her actions. It was only a matter of time before her husband would join her in this act of disbelief and disobedience. That's what happened to Abraham as well. You remember the threefold promise? I've got to pull that up again because I didn't put the scripture up there. I've got all kinds of notes falling down there. Remember, here's the threefold promise. This whole series is based upon this promise. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, your father's household to the land I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Hallelujah! Woo! What a great promise! This is one of the most incredible, most outstanding promises. And then the threats started. God's promises to him and Sarah would never come to pass because they were going to die. It's called the famine. Genesis 12:10. Well, that's only 7 verses down the line. It says, now there was a famine in the land. And it was so severe that their lives and God's promise was threatened. And while the famine was a real threat, apparently there was an escape, and they moved to Egypt. Promise saved. Well, except they get to Egypt and they get in trouble. Well, you see, Abraham asked Sarah to lie and to tell the Egyptians that she was his sister. I guess maybe technically back somehow she was his sister in some way. But he rationalized that this falsehood would save his life. If they were not married, then the Egyptians would not need to kill the husband to steal the wife. Unfortunately, this faulty logic made his beautiful wife available, and Pharaoh decided to take her as his wife. Abraham's sin had created a real mess. You see, if he lost Sarah to Pharaoh or lost his own life trying to save hers, the fulfillment of God's promise would have ended in Egypt before anything would have happened. But the Lord was not caught off guard. He came to rescue them and his promise. He sent serious diseases to afflict Pharaoh and his household. And finally, the Egyptian ruler realized he had been lied to by the foreigners and immediately sent them back to their homeland. Go home. You remember the story, don't you? That could have messed up things big time. And just when it looks like the promise is once again safe, conflict arises within Abraham's family. Chapter 13 relates another threat to the divine promise. You see, Abraham's herdsmen began to quarrel with Lot's herdsmen because the land could not sustain the large number of animals that had accumulated after their arrival. And one of the two would have to move with his family, his servants, and all his flocks and herds. The decision was important because God's promise had been tied to Canaan. Remember, Abraham got the land. Oh no, if he doesn't get the land, what's going to happen? Are you starting to see the drama that's moving through here? They got the promise, there comes the threat. You know, there's a famine, and then they lie and get into sin, and the Pharaoh's going to kill them both, and all that, you know. And then they get back and they start fighting among themselves. A compromise was drawn up between the two parties. Lot chose the best land near the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham settled for what was left over, Canaan. The controversy was resolved and God's promise remained intact. Whew. And after Genesis 13, we read about crisis after crisis. And each time God manages to help Abraham and Sarah avoid a disaster and stay on course without losing their faith in God's original promise. Of course, one of the greatest threats to fulfilling the promise of Genesis 12 is the fact that Sarah was barren. In today's language, it means she had no children and she wasn't bearing any children. That would be a little bit of a threat to a great nation coming from his relationship with her, I would think, if we calculate that exactly. No kids, no descendants, no blessing, the whole world, big problem. Threats. The most important thing to remember is that God would not let Sarah's condition destroy his promise. Sarah, barren? Not a big deal. Oh, I understand, Abraham, it's a big deal to you. Oh, Sarah, I understand it's a big deal to you. It's not a problem. It's my promise. I can deal with it. You remember the famine? Yeah, took care of that. Yeah, remember that problem with Pharaoh? Yeah, took care of that. Remember that little conflict with old Lot there? Took care of that. I can take care of this. My wife, Carrie, has seldom told me that God has spoken to her. That doesn't mean that he hasn't spoken to her. She just hasn't told me. And so one day she surprised me and she told me that what the Lord had spoken to her about a baby we were going to adopt. You see, we had wanted children for several years and exhausted all of the practical medical options. It was the fall of 1989 and we had filled out papers to adopt a few months earlier. And we never realized that prospective parents had to go literally through a gauntlet of paperwork, of references, and a thing called the home study. That's where they come in to make sure that your home and your environment is conducive to bringing a small child in there. Praise the Lord, we were able to pass each phase of the long process. Now we were on the waiting list of the agency we had chosen. Carrie said the Lord had told her that we would be adopting a little girl. But there was more. He had also mentioned the baby would be born in June of 1990. In a word, I was impressed. I was impressed by the detail of the promise. This was not a general impression that indeed we'd be adopting a baby someday and it would be a little girl. It was a specific word from God for a specific couple at a specific place with a specific time. Now, we're kind of skeptics at heart, both of us, and I didn't want her to know my doubts because she was really serious about this, and I couldn't hurt her feelings. And who was I to say that she had heard wrong? She was confident. God had spoken. It was a done deal. It was a promise. Now, there was nothing more than a matter of time. We just have to wait until June, right? Remember, this is fall of 89, baby in June of 90. Got it. A few weeks into 1990, we received a strange call from our adoption agency. They had received a very specific request from another agency in Nebraska. Apparently, the other agency was looking for a couple in our state who were affiliated with the Assemblies of God. Here we are. Oh, the mother was giving her child up for adoption, had made this unusual request, and our agency wanted to know if we'd be willing to talk with the other agency. Willing? Are you kidding? So we talked to the other agency, and we decided to go ahead and work with them. Our initial excitement turned to complete ecstasy when we discovered the baby was to be born in June. We made application with the new agency and we were approved in a few short weeks. The new agency was an open adoption thing, and so we put together a little portfolio of pictures of us and a little bit of history on us, and so we could present it to them because apparently others were doing the same, and she looks at them and she decides which one she wants to be their parents. And good or bad, we didn't care. Baby's coming in June, that baby's ours. She wants an AG couple from Nebraska, that's us. And we were notified that she had selected us. You know, if you've ever been on that adoption trail, the one thing that we never wanted to do was to go and put together a nursery. You know, do all the painting and the little artwork on the walls and the wallpaper and get the crib and the little thingy that hangs there with the animals on it. And, you know, I can't remember all the names of these things, but yeah, we didn't want to do that because, you know, it's one of those things, then you go in there you got to walk by that room to get to the bedroom, and every night you walk by and you go, oh, Jesus, God, we need a baby. We just didn't want to go through that. But our time had arrived, and God had miraculously spoken. Circumstances had supernaturally aligned in our favor. We were only a few short weeks from the baby's birth. The caseworker assured us that we had never had such a certain adoption. We moved ahead with painting and decorating the room. We purchased the baby bed and other furniture. There would be no time to do so in the upcoming weeks because we were getting ready to start camp. We were the camp directors for Nebraska. And so everything had to be ready. As camps began that summer, we were never far from the phone. That was before cell phones, okay? I know some of you can't remember those times, and some of us older people, we don't have a longer memory either, and we can't remember before cell phones. Bob, I'm assuming we got that on, recorded. Boy, why do I say these things? Someone will be listening to that, and they'll be writing me letters. But you know, babies decide the exact moment when they're going to make their appearance on planet Earth. Some come early, some come late. You know, there's nothing you can do, but you just wait. And normally the due date is a rough estimate and based on various factors, and we understood that. So camp days can be very long, and especially for a camp director, and this was a blessing. It was a form of therapy. Business and ministry kept our minds occupied as we waited and we waited. Adoption thoughts were ever present. And I'm sure people wondered why we were always the first one to answer the phone at the campground. If they had only known the truth. The camps that summer were great, but we were emotionally, we were emotionally silly putty. Waiting is a difficult game to play. Still, there was no phone call from the agency, only silence. And silence can often lead to speculation. And so our minds filled with all kinds of speculation. Something's happened to the baby. Something's happened to the mother. She dropped us and chose somebody else. Maybe the baby was born with a life-threatening defect. On and on it went. We hadn't heard anything, and so I finally made the phone call. If they weren't going to call me, then I was going to call them. I was sure it was a big misunderstanding of sorts. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a tragedy for birth mother or for birth baby. It was a broken promise. The person on the other end of the phone told me that the birth father had decided to exercise his parental rights, and the birth mother did not want him in her life or the baby's life, and so she kept the baby to raise it herself. We grieved the loss of our dear little one. Our baby was now someone else's baby. And the thing that we didn't want to do is we went to the stinking nursery and we cried. We voiced our frustration with the God that would pull such a cruel trick on his children. Carrie had heard him speak. We had received a promise. Months before, she had known the sex of the baby the month that she was to be born. And the agency sought us out. I mean, just think of all the coincidences that were there. They weren't coincidences. God had brought it together. We were sure of it. The birth mother had chosen us. This was more than a threat to the promise. This was a promise that just went wrong. It was a promise that had not been kept. How now heaven was silent and we were left to interpret what had happened and struggle along with our wavering faith. Some of you know this type of thing. Yet there are times when our faith must swim upstream against a current of doubt, against the rushing waters of disillusionment, constantly beating against us. Its goal is to overwhelm us and drown out our hope. The river of disappointment is relentless at times. And yet somehow we must swim on. Something deep inside of us compels us not to give up. Every muscle, every ounce of strength is focused on making it just one more inch, one more foot, one more day. It's not so much a matter of reaching some destination, but having a purpose when we finally reach that destination. Then and only then is the fight worth the sacrifice. This was much more than losing a baby. The crisis that summer threatened our faith in God. Certainly, there were good reasons to walk away from him. Have you ever been at that point when you looked at everything, you laid it out on the table, and you say, I think it's time to give God an adios. It's time to walk away. Have you been that disillusioned? Have you been that hurt? We had trusted him. And the relationship had been shattered, and there we were left to pick up the pieces. How could we continue to preach and teach others about a loving God who wouldn't even honor his word? You say you're being pretty rough on God. No rougher than you've been. And yet, despite the confusion, despite the hurt, despite the inconclusiveness of the matter, something compelled us to believe that somehow, some way, the Lord would find a way out of this mess He had created. We were gasping for air, swimming with all our might. We called our original adoption agency, and we begged to come back. Because you don't just run from one agency to the next. They took us back. Later that year, November 1st, see, our disappointment, all of this struggle was back in the summer. Can you imagine trying to run a camp for teenagers when you're going through this turmoil? I don't even, when I talk about swimming upstream, I mean, the water was going into our mouth at times. We were having to spit it out because we were drowning. November 1st of 1990. The secretary on the intercom interrupted my work with the words, "You have a phone call on line 1." I punched the flashing light with my finger because I would take the call. I hated calling people back. I still hate calling people back. If you call and I'm available, I'm going to take your call. It was our adoption agency, and I was surprised. I wasn't expecting their call. At first, I thought something had gone wrong again. However, I soon realized they were calling us about an adoption. And I remember she said to me, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Of course I'm sitting down. I'm in an office." I sat stunned as the young lady explained that there were 2 babies that needed parents. Twin girls. Born on June 1st. Not May 31st. June 1st, 1990. What's really interesting, during our initial interview, Carrie said, "What do you do with twins? You don't adopt them out to separate parents, do you?" I thought, oh my goodness, Carrie, just be quiet for once. And she went on and on and on about these twins. I always thought we'd adopt twins. And she was just going on and on and on. And really, as we walked out of there, I thought, I hope they forget this whole twin thing. They had put a note in our file. So when the twins were available, we got the call. Twin babies, born in June, Carrie's dream, God's promise, have been merged together to give us a special blessing, a double blessing. The adoption took several weeks, and there were a few more obstacles between us and parenthood, but God had chosen us from the beginning of time to become Katie and Kristen's parents. It was just enough time for us to go buy another baby bed and put it in the nursery that we had prepared. It was just enough time for us to actually realize what God had done. This is the next slide, Joan. Despite all the threats to His promise, despite our fragile faith, He kept His word. The way it had been done was nothing short of miraculous. He had surprised us with the depth of His kindness and goodness. And we were amazed at His faithfulness. It was a lesson learned. God is trustworthy. He does what He says. No threat is too big or too strong for Him to overcome. God keeps His promises. When pressed, most Christians would agree with this conclusion, or at least they would know that they should agree with it. However, just below the surface of their consciousness lies a past moment etched deeply in the memory when they gave up on a divine promise that had been smothered by a threat. I believe God's given all of you promises. The threats came, and the promise was buried. In the beginning, it had been easy to believe. Everything moved forward in harmony according to expectations. But something happened. Something big challenged the dream God had given. It really doesn't matter if the problem was too big for their God or their God was too small for their problem. The end result was the same. They stopped believing. And somehow the promise had become a cruel joke. You see, they had told family and friends and God's plans. They declared their faith before believer and unbeliever alike. And now they're making excuses for God's failure in a feeble attempt to hide their own embarrassment and disappointment. You see, that's the way threats work. They're bullies. They push believers to abandon the hope that God is going to do something special in their lives. When this happens, the father of lies and the father of threats, he wins. So as we come to the conclusion of our service, I'm asking you once again, when has God spoken to you? What has he told you? What are the promises that he's laid before you? Do you still believe? You say, Pastor, well, you don't understand. That was 40 years ago. I'm not sure I can remember back about too much about it. You remember? You remember the testimony of my father. Many of you were here the Sunday that I shared that. It took a lot of years for that to come out. Nearly 50 years, but God was faithful to his promise. And all I'm asking, you say, circumstances are changed. You don't understand. I'm not who I was. Well, God may modify the promise a little bit. He's not forgotten. You think God is absent-minded? There were conditions that were attached. And I don't know what the conditions were, that you need to do this, you need to do that, or whatever. But because of the threat, you threw the conditions out. Well, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'll tell you that for sure. Keep believing in God, keep swimming upstream. You got to be kidding. I'm asking you to believe again. If God has spoken, I'm asking you to hold on. That's a threat. And most of the threats are lies. They're illusions. You see, we believed an illusion. We believed that one baby was an illusion. That was a lie. By the way, we know the rest of the story. We found out later, I won't go into detail, that the young lady kept her baby. She stayed at home with her parents for a while, began to raise that child. She eventually married a good Christian man, and everything turned out well for her. That baby was never intended for us. But you see how the enemy just crossed us long enough to bring that threat. And we almost, and I don't even know how we kept going on. Again, it's swimming upstream when every muscle and everything in your body aches and hurts, and you just keep going and you keep believing. And that's what I'm asking you to do today. Keep believing. Keep believing. It's the same with our church. It's the same with our church. We've gotten promises in this church before, and things have happened. We can't ignore that. They've happened, and they appear to be threats that are going to destroy whatever promise that God has given the church. I tell you, God will fulfill his promises if we will fulfill the conditions that are with that promise. Those threats are just illusions. They're just a hiccup for God. Just like Sarah being barren. God says, I got it. I got this. And we're saying, you got what? You got to be kidding me. You got what? He says, I've got it. I'll tell you this much. Our faith grew as we saw God destroy the threat to his promise. Our faith grew. I wish I could say it happened while it was going on. But we looked back and we saw what God had done. Let me leave you with this thought. God never forgets what He's promised. He always stands poised to finish what He started. I think it's just time to ignore the threats. Lower our head and just keep swimming upstream. It's time to start believing again. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Forgive us, Lord. Some of us have buried your promises so deep. They were buried under sin. They were buried under a failed marriage. They were buried under an illness. They were buried under a death. They were buried by circumstances. They were buried by attacks. And we ask for your forgiveness. And Lord, we ask that you will renew your promise with each and every one of us today. Lord, I've tried to be faithful to preach your word and to pour it out where people can totally understand it, Lord. And Lord, I wish I could stand before you and before them today and say that I've got this figured out. Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for looking at threats. For listening to lies. For not believing, Lord. Forgive me, Lord. Lord, will you renew our faith in you today? Will you renew our faith in your promises? Not only the promises, Lord, in your book, in your word, but the promises that you've given each and every one of us. Let us not be conned, Lord. Let us not be conned. Let things be untwisted that are twisted. Lord, let us see truth for what it is. Stand with me, please. I know some of you need to pray today. I invite you to the altar. Don't hesitate. Don't sit there and go, oh, I think, well, maybe should I go? I don't know. Maybe I should. Well, come on down to the altar. Come on down. Come on down. Just find a place of prayer. If you want to stand, you can't kneel. You got bad knees. You can't get up if you get down. You just come on down here and stand for a little while. Turn around right there in your chair. Make it an altar if you can't come down here. Let's just pray to the Lord. The Lord wants to renew some promises today. He wants to renew. He was telling you today, prophetically, He was telling you He hasn't forgotten. He hasn't forgotten His promise. Just find a place of prayer. I'm going to come down and pray with those who want. If you have another need and would like to be anointed with oil, I'm down here to pray as well. If you'd like to sing and worship with us, we ask you to do that too. If you need to hit the road, we understand. God bless you.